Welcome back, everyone. And for all of you that are watching us at home online, welcome back as well. Our next guest came all the way from Sweden, originally from Illinois. After graduating high school, he went to travel extensively throughout Europe and the Middle East. He went to live in Oslo, Norway, and began studying Middle Eastern culture and history at the University of Oslo. During this time abroad, he had the opportunity to live in various parts of Europe as well in the Middle East, including Israel. While living in Israel, he learned about Zionism, straight from the pioneers of Zionism. Witnessing firsthand this Jewish supremacy ideology and finding himself constantly being racially profiled, he quickly realized the deep, imminent threat Zionism is to the world. After returning to the United States, he enrolled at the University of California in Santa Cruz, earning a history degree with an emphasis on Israel and Palestine. But prior to completing his degree, he had taken a journalism course that required him to return to Israel. This time, he brought a journalist with him, as well as a photojournalist. Their project was to capture the architecture throughout Palestine, which also included the West Bank and in Gaza. Needless to say, they captured more than just architecture. By this time, the occupation was in full force. Military checkpoints everywhere, snipers on rooftops, communities made up of illegal settlements, and several refugee camps were established. While visiting a refugee camp, they had learned that the Israeli army was not allowing Palestinians through the checkpoints in order to go to the hospital and receive medical attention. Upon returning to the United States, they found themselves detained at the airport in Tel Aviv. Their camera and all their documentation was confiscated. 2 hours later, everything was returned to them, but only the content that they had approved. All other material was deleted. This systematic form of oppression opened his eyes to a culture of hate, bigotry, self-righteousness, and evil. Then 9/11 happened. The false flag operation to justify the war on terror and the destabilization of the Middle East. This is what led him to become an American journalist and researcher, uncovering the truths behind 9/11 attacks. He is known for his activism work, been featured in numerous articles, held several interviews throughout the country as well as internationally. In addition, he's a world-renowned speaker and the author of Solving 9/11 Original Articles, The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East, and Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. It is my honor to present and welcome Christopher Boland.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Is this on right? I guess. Can you hear me all right? I don't know if I have this on right. I have a little message from Sweden, from my wife, to you all. She wants to greet you. And the message is this, in line with what Marty was saying, with what Claudia was saying. This is a quote from Kurt Vonnegut, and it says, "There is no reason why good cannot triumph as often as evil. The triumph of anything is a matter of organization. If there are such things as angels, I hope that they are organized along the lines of the mafia." That's from Kurt Vonnegut. And that's very true. What Claudio Marti has done here with the I Am the Face of the Truth is that he has put a face on the 9/11 Truth Movement. And that is a remarkable thing. You think about what would the Truth Movement be today if there were no Face of Truth organization. So he's put the face on it and done it in a very good way. Now, my presentation is in line with the text of this photograph that was taken of me at the Oscars a couple of years ago. I'm going to the Oscars tomorrow as well, with this kind of protest, one-man protest, with the image, with the message, "Solving 9/11 ends the war." And that's basically what my presentation is about here today, how understanding the relationship between 9/11 and the war on terror. The United States is in a very serious predicament right now. We are involved in the longest war in U.S. history, the most expensive war in U.S. history. There is no political debate on ending it, and there's virtually no public resistance to it. So you are the vanguard of the 9/11 Truth Movement, and we have to reach more people. We have to grow this organization. We have to grow the Face of Truth organization to the 50,000 number that Claudio pointed to. And we have to grow the awareness. This is a revolution of awareness. When enough Americans understand the cost of the war on terror and its relationship to the 9/11 deception, then we will have a proper anti-war movement in this country, and which is vitally needed. If we don't stop this war, it will destroy this nation. So without further ado, my background is I was an investigative journalist in Washington when 9/11 happened, and I had a degree from the University of California in Middle Eastern history, Israel and Palestine. And I'm the author of the Solving 9/11 set of books. And prior to that, I grew up in Chicago, outside Chicago, in a place called Schaumburg, Illinois, where I was an Eagle Scout and recipient of the God and Country Award. This photograph is from a citizens grand jury that we held in California in 2004. This is my big book. It's Solving 9/11, the original articles. This contains the first 11 years of articles that I wrote on the subject, starting from September 2001, chronologically moving forward to the publication in 2012. This is my little book in Solving 9/11. It's a set of books. This is Solving 9/11, the deception that changed the world. And this book and my research is actually unique in the 9/11 literature in that I focus on who was behind 9/11 and why it was done. 9/11 was a policy coup by deception. It was a false flag terror operation that was meant to be blamed on Muslims in order to start the war on terror. The real strategy behind the war on terror is a Zionist plan to redraw the map of the Middle East, which is currently being done. Recognizing the common origin of 9/11 and the war on terror plan is crucial to comprehending the nature of the deception that has changed our world. You have to understand what is at stake and who's behind it. If you're misled by what they tell you on the media, you'll never stop it because you're misled. So what is the war on terror and where did it come from? Well, as I said, 9/11 was a policy coup that brought us the war on terror and a series of costly wars. This photograph is from Iraq. The fraudulent war on terror is based on the official myth of 9/11. So they've given us this narrative of 9/11, blaming Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and Muslims in order to have the war on terror. And it's all based on this edifice that's been held up by the controlled media. But when you break down, when you understand that 9/11 is a deception, then you understand that the war on terror is a fraud, then the cat's out of the bag. The people who promote this long war, they call it the Long War. This is the Long War Journal. It's the global war on terror. As I said, it's the longest and most expensive war in U.S. history, and there is no public resistance to it, and no political debate on ending it. Why is that? How can that be changed? There was, of course, one politician from California, Barbara Lee, who got an amendment in to initiate debate, 6-month debate on the war on terror funding. But Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, in the middle of the night, he just pulled it out of the bill, just like that. He just pulled it right out of the legislation, preventing it from being discussed. And of course, you know that the war on terror has been going on for 16 years. It went from George Bush to Barack Obama to Donald Trump. So it's gone from hard right to hard left to hard right. So it doesn't matter who's in office. The war goes on. The cost of the war on terror is immense. for example, in Afghanistan, we're spending $4 million per hour. That's what the cost of it is. That's almost $100 million a day. And the cost of the war since 2001, it's 1.82 trillion plus Homeland Security, another 800 billion. So $2.6 trillion, that's just already spent. When you calculate in all the future costs, we're talking about $5 trillion already spent on the war. This is the amount of money that's being spent on per victim of terrorism. The United States is spending $400 million per year per U.S. victim of terrorism. But look at the comparison with other leading causes of death. The leading causes of death like cancer, influenza, heart disease. And you see that this is not any sort of sensible expenditure of money. This is a criminal fraud. This is an immense waste of money. This data is up-to-date data coming from a group called National Priorities Project. And they show you the cost of the wars, and it's constantly clicking all these figures. Now, this quote from the international movie is very interesting. He says, looking at the cost of this conflict, looking at there's no national interest, he says, the real value of a conflict, the true value, is in the debt that it creates. You control the debt, you control everything. This is the very essence of the banking industry, to make us all, whether we are nations or individuals, slaves to debt. And as our nation spends more and more money that it doesn't have, it's all borrowed money, on the war on terror, we are increasing the enslavement of our nation to those banksters. And unfortunately, our current president has signed up to the war on terror, hook, line, and sinker. He said in August 21st, when he spoke on Afghanistan, he says, 9/11, the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history, was planned and directed from Afghanistan. So that's when he increased his contribution of troops to Afghanistan. Well, he said, when he made this speech, he said that when he was running for office, he said his instinct was to pull out of Afghanistan. But when he got into the office, he realized decisions are made differently, and he changed his tune. Here is a cartoon that is showing how, the United States is going from Afghan war for the first 17 years now into Trump's war. And this is a very wise quote from Sun Tzu, The Art of War, from the 6th century BC. There is no instance of a nation benefiting from prolonged warfare. We have to understand that as the longer we stay in the war, the more damage we're doing to this country, as well as every country that we're engaged in. The initial fraud. 9/11 was a false flag terror atrocity meant to create fear and rage in the American population to get public opinion to support the war on terror. A pre-planned war agenda of Zionist origin, a Zionist war agenda, to be waged by the United States under the pretext of fighting terrorism. Starting the war on terror was the primary reason for the false flag terror of 9/11. Now, Israel, this is the first prime minister of Israel. I'm showing that Israel has had expansionist policies from the very beginning. This is in 1948, May of 48, just weeks after Israel became a state, when they declared their independence. And David Ben-Gurion, the prime minister and the first president of Israel, he said, we should prepare to go over on the offensive with the aim of smashing Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. And if Egypt gets in the way, we'll crush them too. So this expansionist policies from the very beginning. Now, this drawing is by David Dees, this illustration is by David Dees, but the quote underneath of it is from the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States military. In 1948, shortly before Israel became a state, they had done 13 papers on what Israel would mean to the United States. And the last paper concluded that Zionist strategy, Zionist is the state of Israel, the nation state, Zionist strategy will seek to involve the United States in a continuously widening and deepening series of operations intended to secure maximum Jewish objectives. And those maximum Jewish objectives included the expansion of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, into Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and the establishment of Jewish military and economic hegemony over the entire Middle East. And as you can see, these are the countries that have already been attacked in the war on terror: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. Now Syria is in the target zone. And Hillary Clinton, in one of those leaked emails, why they hate the leaker so much, I think it was Assange, WikiLeaks, Secretary of State Clinton wrote in 2012 that the best way to help Israel is to use force in Syria to overthrow the government. And that's when Obama began spending $1 billion a year on hiring these mercenaries and these rebel radicals who have caused so much havoc and destruction in Syria. These armies that are of terrorists are paid mercenaries. And we, the United States, have covertly supported the war in Syria for 6-7 years now. It's completely illegal. There is no U.S. interest in Syria. The only reason we're doing this is to help Israel. Now, this is a note about the press. This is from Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson said nothing, because the press is as Claudia said, the press is the big problem. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Nothing can be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle. The man who never looks into a newspaper is better informed than he who reads them, inasmuch as he who knows nothing is nearer to the truth than he whose mind is filled with falsehoods and errors." And that's the problem, is that the mass media has persuaded most Americans that the war on terror is a good thing, that the Muslims did 9/11, never mind the pictures of the exploding towers, never mind any of the facts. That's the narrative that most Americans still believe. And that's part of the reason why this nation is so ill today. Because we are a grossly deceived nation, and a deceived nation doing bad things. That's just really bad for us as people, as a nation, as communities. So the New York Times on September 12th came out with this headline, which contains several falsehoods. But never mind, that's the story. Hijacked jets destroy the Twin Towers and hit the Pentagon. So the media, ever since, for the last 16 years, has imposed on the public the false story that radical Islamic terrorists are to blame for 9/11. Nothing could be further from the truth. But that is the truth that most Americans live by. Now, the only way to liberate ourselves from the madness of the war on terror is to expose the true source of terrorism. And that's what I will try to do with this little presentation. U.S. has been attacked before by Israel. The attack on the USS Liberty in 1967 was a planned and concerted Israeli military attack on a defenseless American ship. It was a spy ship, granted. It was in international waters off the coast of Egypt, but it was mercilessly attacked by Israeli planes and ships and torpedoes with an attempt to kill all Americans on the ship in order that the blame would be put on Egypt. So you can see that this has been done before. And then earlier in 1954, these three men on the left, Shimon Peres, Pinchas Lavon, and Moshe Dayan, they were involved in a false flag terror operation called the Lavon Affair, where Israeli agents put bombs into American and British buildings like theaters and cultural libraries in Egypt with the intent that the blame would be put on the Muslim Brotherhood and put a wedge between Egypt and the United States. And they were caught. They were caught by Egyptians, and some people were hanged. And these three guys got away. This photograph, they're smiling. They don't mind. These are the masterminds. Shimon Peres, the man on the far left, was foreign minister of Israel on 9/11. Just to give you an idea of how. And this is him. This is a picture of him that I put into this terrorist garb. When he was found, when it was discovered by the prime minister of Israel that what these guys had done in the Lavon affair, unbeknownst to him, he was very, very critical about Peres. And he says, Peres shares the same ideology as Lavon. He wants to frighten the West into supporting Israel's aims. Bingo. That's what it's all about. The whole operation of terrorism works on the principle that if you scare the target population, the American population, if you scare them enough, they will go along with whatever plan you give them to get away from that fear. That's how terrorism works. So for 16 years, the controlled media has pushed this false narrative about 9/11 and the war on terror, all the while suppressing real evidence that disproves the official myth of 9/11. And you see, the Time magazine is quite happy to say that the war on terror will never end. And you remember that's what George Bush said in the very beginning. This war will go on for generations. So if the government and media are lying to us about 9/11, it means they are controlled by the same people who carried out 9/11. That is our political predicament today. And it's a very dire straits that we are in. So, the 3 essential steps to understanding 9/11. First, you have to grasp the uncomfortable fact that we have been deceived about what happened on 9/11. Then, you have to understand that 9/11 was carried out to start the war on terror. And thirdly, to recognize the common origin of the 9/11 deception and the war on terror. And this image down below, the map down below, shows you the way that these countries are being broken up into pieces along ethnic lines. That's the plan. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So how have we been deceived about 9/11? How we have been deceived. This is the pack of lies that the 9/11 Commission report that was given to the American people as the explanation, the final explanation on 9/11. But it was produced by this man, Philip Zelikow, who completed an outline of the 9/11 Commission report before the staff even began working, complete with bullet points and subtitles and sub-subtitles. And he framed the agenda, led the research staff, and decided what evidence the commission saw. He wound up being appointed after Henry Kissinger was turned down. He was the first choice, Henry Kissinger. This is the senior counsel of the 9/11 Commission who said that the U.S. government made a decision not to tell the truth about what happened. He said what government and military officials told Congress, the Commission, the media, and the public about who knew what when was almost entirely and inexplicably untrue. Now, this is the senior lawyer for the 9/11 Commission telling you that. And here are the 2 co-chairmen. Thomas Keane on the left said, to this day, we don't know why NORAD told us what they told us. It was just so far from the truth. NORAD was the American-Canadian Joint Air Defense Exercise group that was running exercises that day. But they're the ones who are supposed to protect the American continent from foreign attack. And they completely dropped the ball that day. Their planes were not even able to go and intercept these slow-moving passenger aircraft, which they do on a regular basis. What happened? Well, on 9/11, there's a few points here I'm going to show, not in great detail, but this is some of the things that you need to understand that show very clearly we've been lied to about 9/11. First of all, the first plane went into the North Tower. It went into a computer room, a computer floor that was run by Marsh McLennan Company. Marsh McLennan Company was headed by Jeffrey Greenberg, the son of Maurice Greenberg, who was the man from AIG who got the big bailout in 2008, 2009. This is also the same company who provided Jerry Bremer, who became the administrator of occupied Iraq under the Coalition Provisional Authority for the first 3 years. It went right into their computer room. Now you see this white burst of cloud coming out of part of the computer room there. The plane's gone in this side, and you have this immense white burst coming out. That's not jet fuel. That's nothing from the plane exploding. That is evidence of an explosion inside the building that's making white smoke. What is that? Here's the plane that hit the South Tower, and you can see that this plane, supposedly Flight 175, United Airlines, has some strange attachment to the bottom of it, and you can see that the bottom of the plane is not the dark blue, or well, it's got the groove down the middle. This is not, doesn't look like Flight 175. And what happened just before the plane struck the building, just before, it emitted something from the bottom, a white flash that struck the building just before the plane hit. That's not Flight 175. That doesn't have that kind of equipment. And here you see, just before the plane hit, that object, that missile-like object that struck the building had opened up a large white hole. That hole is white because it's extremely hot. So this is indicative of a depleted uranium warhead. When depleted uranium hits something like it's an armor-piercing round or missile warhead, it hits the building, it hits whatever it's going to strike with a temperature of about 6,000 degrees Celsius. So it's white hot and just melts its way right through everything. And obviously, this whatever made this very, very hot hole then went in through the building and made an extremely hot space inside that building. And here you see, well, if it was depleted uranium warhead, you would see that warhead coming out the other side. And lo and behold, that's what we see here, down here. That's a white hot burning object coming out with great momentum. And as I said, it's white hot because it's burning about 6,000 degrees Celsius. It's an armor-piercing and incendiary weapon. It's used all the time in Iraq and Afghanistan and Yugoslavia. In fact, the use of these depleted uranium warheads has contaminated a very large section of Iraq, making it uninhabitable for thousands of years. Because although it's called depleted uranium, there's nothing depleted about it. It still has all the contamination effects of normal radiation of uranium. And here we see the entry of flight 175 into the tower, and you see this tremendous explosion coming out the entry point. This is the entry point. The planes come in here at 500 miles an hour, but you see this very energetic explosion coming out the entry wound. That's not burning jet fuel. Over here you see burning jet fuel. It's a completely different color with a lot of carbon. This is something else. And here this is the tremendous explosions that occurred when the plane hit 175 hit the South Tower. And you see that there's around the edges there's this white smoke, which is strongly indicative of thermite, which suggests that also a computer floor was loaded with thermite, pre-placed thermite. So when that missile came through, that stuff went off and created this spectacular effect. This is the kind of stuff that's used in Hollywood all the time for spectacles. This is the spectacle they got. And the white hot object coming out at great momentum is not part of the aircraft. So this is just to give you some indication that something quite different happened just when the planes hit than what we've been told. Then again, I had done work on depleted uranium missiles and danger, and I showed these photographs to my scientist at Lawrence Livermore, and asked him, does this object have the characteristics of a depleted uranium warhead? And he said, yes, it does. See, it's burning so hot that it takes time before this oxides are formed, because this is 6,000 degrees Celsius. It's very, very hot. Then we were told that Muslims were blamed for 9/11, but they were falsely blamed. 15 of these guys lived in Hollywood, Florida. Duplicate license had been issued for at least 6 of them. Another 6 or so had reported having lost their passports. And such duplicate documents are used to allow others to use the same identity. Identity theft. It's basic. And create false histories. So these photographs are these men, but these men were not the ones on the planes. Here we have, BBC reported a few days later that several of them, 4 of them at least, had come forward and said, hey, like this guy, he was living in Casablanca. He said his photograph was released, and he has since appeared in newspapers and television around the world. His name is Walid al-Sheikhi. And you know, these people were alive and well. So if these guys were alive and well, who was on the plane? So you can clearly see that false identities were being used. And then Robert Mueller, the head of the CIA, told CNN a year later, he said, there is no legal proof to prove the identities of the suicidal hijackers. So what are we dealing with here? The whole story is complete deception. What kind of deception is it? It's an Israeli deception. I highly recommend reading this book, The Little Drummer Girl. It's also a movie by George Roy Hill, but the book, it makes more sense because it's a very complicated thing. Little Drummer Girl, it's good, put on your bedside table. And in the book, and in the movie, Diane Keaton plays the role of the British actress who works with the Mossad to basically ensnare a Palestinian in terrorism. And they lay a trail for this Palestinian all the way from Istanbul across Eastern Europe up to Germany. And then in Germany, a bomb goes off in a synagogue, but it's all fake. They put bomb charges in the windows and things like that. And then the Palestinian, of course, is blown up in an autobahn on a Tankstelle at a parking place on the autobahn, and the case is closed. The Palestinian did it. And if you read this book, you will understand exactly how it's written. This book was written by John le Carré with the help of Israeli military intelligence. He writes that in the very acknowledgments in the beginning of the book. And so Israel is showing some of their tricks about how they lay a false trail, a false history for a hijacker. This is exactly what was done in Florida here prior to 9/11. Then there's some basic things to understand. No steel high-rise frame building, high-rise, has ever collapsed due to fire. And if you look, this is the late 60s, early 70s. These buildings were built to stand 1,000 years. They were overbuilt. We don't build buildings like this at all anymore. But this building wasn't going anywhere without a lot of explosives being attached to it. And that's what we see. We see abundant evidence of explosives, explosions on 9/11. Here you see a squib coming out far below. But the very fact alone that elements of the construction elements of the building are being thrust sideways with great velocity. These things are heavy. There was one piece that weighed 600,000 pounds that was thrown like a football field. Where does that energy come from? That's not a fire. That's not a gravity collapse that's induced by fire, which is what we've been told. This is explosive, and I think that any small child looking at this happening will tell you that's an explosion. The building's exploding. And sure enough, this explosive superthermite was found in the dust. This took a little time. It was finally published in 2009, but that's been a long time already. That's 9 years. So this discovery of this explosive nanothermite, this is thermite made using nanotechnology, basically combining the elements at almost a molecular level. And when this was found, this was the end of the official story as a plausible explanation. This entered a whole. That's when we. Ever since that time, September 2009, the government's narrative has been on thin ice. It's dead. It's dead in the water. And the 9/11 Truth Movement has all the evidence now to show that the government's lied to us. But has anything changed? Nothing's changed. Here we have an evidence of a thermite reaction, not nanothermite, but a normal thermite reaction. This is on the South Tower, east corner, and this coming from the 81st floor right here. You have a thermatic reaction going on, and a thermite reaction creates three things. It creates white smoke, aluminum oxide. It creates intense heat, and it creates molten iron, molten whatever the oxidizer is. In this case, probably iron. And here we see 1 minute later this cascade of molten metal pouring off the 80th floor of the building. How did that happen? How did that stuff get into the building in the first place? And now this is from WABC TV. This is not any sort of like, truther thing. This is coming from WABC TV, the ABC affiliate in New York City. So what the government has done and the official investigation has done, they don't talk about this. If they talk about it, they ignore it as much as they can. Because this disproves the official story completely, the molten metal. That's one thing you can remember. And in the dust of the World Trade Center, those big clouds that went through Manhattan, about 10%, at least 6%, were these little balls, little tiny tennis balls of molten iron. And there's no explanation how that can be created, because this requires temperatures much higher than the fire that would have been caused by the plane. So what did this? Well, this is exactly what is produced with superthermite, what I showed you before. When superthermite reacts, it produces these little tiny droplets of molten iron with a little bit of aluminum in there. And then there's this critter. This is also from the U.S. Geological Survey of the dust. This is a similar ball, but this is molybdenum. Again, where did this stuff come from? Well, this is a kind of a boring chart, but this shows you thermites. These are thermites up here. And these first four things are thermites, and these are high explosives. And what this shows you is that from the Department of Defense, that thermites have more energy per gram than high explosives. That means that there's more power that is produced. And when you reduce the size of the particles using nanotechnology, you increase greatly the explosive potential of the material. And then the firefighters talked about seeing molten steel. They say you get down below and you see molten steel running down the channel rails like you're in a foundry, like lava, like a volcano. But the government and the government reports have completely ignored what firefighters saw that day because it doesn't fit with the official story. And the official story is protected only because they have to have the war. Peter Tully told me in 2002 that he had seen pools of literally molten steel at the base of the World Trade Center. So when they finally got down to the bedrock of Manhattan, which was 5, 6, 7 basement levels down, and it got to the bedrock, they found they called it steel, molten steel in pools, still molten, still liquid. And that indicated that something very odd was going on. Okay, so reactions much hotter than boiling iron beneath the rubble then produced this smoke laden with nanoparticles. And these fires, the so-called fires, went on until Christmas of 2001. Until Christmas, the pile was super hot and was making this smoke. Now this, if you remember the Christy Todd Whitman, I think her name was, she was the head of the EPA. She told the people of New York that the air was safe to breathe. Well, if you were anywhere near this area and near this smoke, you were in danger of lethal contamination with nanoparticles, because this smoke contained huge amounts of nanoparticles. And if you were to inhale that, those particles are so small, they go into the nucleus of the human cell. They don't stop in your lungs or your chest or your tissue. They go all the way into the nucleus of the human cell and lodge there. And then they start messing with your DNA and stuff. And that's why 1,600 firefighters have died of cancer as a result. So as they removed the rubble, they found these incredible hot spots just below the surface. And these firefighters were walking on the pile without a stitch of protection. But you can't really protect yourselves against nanoparticles because they're so small. You would have to go with like a moon suit with your own oxygen to be able to be safe on this pile. And so that's why so many men have died. 1,600 of these men have died. There's another, I think, 5,700 who are gravely ill with cancer today. So it's a public health concern of New York, of incredible. And that's why, Mayor Bloomberg for a long time, for the first 12 years, kept the lid on the pot, so to speak, by keeping it silent, by threatening people from talking. The firefighters have been threatened. Firefighters in New York have been threatened. I've seen that firsthand. So we've been deceived about 9/11 in order to get public support for the war on terror. And the war on terror is, in fact, really also a war on Islam, whether you agree with that or not. But that is very much the victims of the war are mostly Muslims and Muslim nations. And we went right to war. You need to understand that what the government did on 9/11 is that they said this attack is an act of war. That's a legal term. And that meant that instead of going to a court of law and investigating the evidence and finding out who was guilty, they said this was done by bad guys from a foreign country. We're going to go and make war with them. And that precluded any investigation from ever happening. That's why 9/11 has never been investigated. Americans need to understand that there has never been an investigation of the evidence of 9/11. Rather, there was a 24/7 destruction of evidence as we went to war. And Larry Johnson, the former deputy director of counterterrorism, said he looked at this is in the Sun Sentinel from Florida, and he was looking at this the way that these guys had fake identities and left these trails and things like that. And he says we don't have anything in history to compare with this. The only thing that comes close to it is a former Soviet intelligence operation, because it was very sophisticated, very highly planned, way beyond the ability of most Americans to figure it out, because it's a very intricate and very long planned, sophisticated crime. So the war on terror began, the crime was done. The war, without any evidence, the Bush administration declared war on Afghanistan, claiming Al-Qaeda was behind 9/11. And then NATO took over the operation, in which hundreds of thousands of Americans and Europeans have served. George Bush said a couple days after he came back from Camp David on 9/11, he said, this crusade, this war on terrorism is going to take a while. He was criticized for using the word crusade, but not for saying it's going to last a while. And then he declared the war on terror on September 20th, saying that every nation, every region has a decision to make. Either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. So all Europeans had to decide, what are we going to do? Are we going to send some doctors, or are we going to send some guys that, they did. They had to. And if you didn't, like France, you were lambasted. French fries became Liberty fries. They did the exact same thing in World War I with the Germans. Things became Liberty kraut, for example. Sauerkraut became Liberty kraut and what like that. Because if you don't go along with the war, if you oppose the American or the Empire's war plan, you are out. So the war began October 7th, 2001. With B-52 dropping bombs on what is the poorest country in Asia. Afghanistan is the poorest country in Asia, has absolutely no air force or no defense, and it was just carpet bombed. Well, that's what they had promised before. Either you accept our carpet of gold, or we will carpet bomb you. So they got carpet bombed. And all of this is legal in American law under something called the AUMF, Authorization for Use of Military Force. Now, this paragraph is this is the critical paragraph. The president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, or harbored such organizations. So it gives the president the sole authority to decide who he is going to attack. Doesn't have to present any evidence to anybody. So here we are 16 years later. These are just some of the countries that we have attacked using this AUMF. And that's the authorization, and that gives them the funding. People have to understand that the War on Terror is not just the name. It's the funding and the authorization for U.S. aggression in the Middle East. Were these countries involved in the terror attacks of 9/11? No. You can say maybe Afghanistan was if you have proof for that, but none of these people were. None of these countries were. Now, last summer, the latest phase of the War on Terror has been in Iraq and Syria. And we helped the Kurds, the Kurdish forces, to ethnically cleanse two big Arab cities, Raqqa in Syria and Mosul in Iraq. This is the Combined Joint Task Force, Operation Inherent Resolve. 68 countries were involved in this against two cities in Syria and Iraq. And this is what they did. They didn't talk about it much. They talked more about Aleppo when Aleppo was being pounded. But they didn't. This is the famous mosque of Al-Nuri in Mosul, destroyed in the battle. And we laid waste to the city, laid waste to it. And to give you an idea where it is, Mosul is here. It's the second biggest city in Iraq. And this is what has become the Kurdish area. All of this dark area, this is the Kurdish area. And this is where the U.S. troops are helping the Kurds to segment or to break off a piece of Iraq and give it to the Kurds. And this is the rich area in oil as well. This is a huge oil field, the Kirkuk field, the huge field. And what's been going on until recently is that the oil is being taken out of here, shipped up here to Turkey by pipeline, and taken to the sea in Ceyhan, taken to the Mediterranean Sea, and then taken down to Israel. And Israel was then selling that oil on because it's stolen oil. No other country could buy it unless Israel sold it to them. And there's a very close connection between the Kurdish area of Iraq and Israel. This is the leader. This was the leader up until recently. His name is Masoud Barzani. The Barzani family is a Jewish family in the Kurdish community. And here we have his father, Mustafa Barzani, meeting with the head of Mossad back in the 1960s. Another Israeli guy here. And here we have Mustafa Barzani, father of Masoud, meeting with Moshe Dayan on a trip to Israel in 1966. So the Israelis have been helping very closely. This is the Kurdish flag and this is the Israeli flag. And this is a very close connection because the Israelis want to break Iraq up and they want to foment problems in the Middle East by supporting these smaller ethnic groups like the Kurds. That's basically how it works. So here's the Kurdish area, and they had a referendum last September for independence. The whole world said, no, not so fast, not so fast. Israel said, yeah, good, it's a good idea. And Israel was the only state, or the first state, to endorse an independent Kurdistan. But the Iraqi army came back and said, no, we're not going to let you run away with our oil so fast. Here's Syria. This is Raqqa. And this is another city that was being attacked under this American War on Terror thing last summer, Operation Inherent Resolve. At least half of the city was totally destroyed. Half of the city is like this. And now the situation is that the U.S. with the Kurdish SDF have lopped off this eastern third of Syria. This is the Euphrates River. So everything east of the Euphrates River up to Iraq and Turkey is now U.S. controlled with the Kurds. So what is this? With support from the U.S. military, they have taken control of Syria's oil-producing area east of the Euphrates River. Why is the United States supporting rebel forces who are fragmenting Syria and Iraq? Why are we doing this? Well, this is Wesley Clark. He was the head commander of U.S. forces in Europe during the operation in Yugoslavia under Clinton, and he was running for president in 2007. He said, speaking in California, he said, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, if you're an American, you ought to be concerned about the strategy of the United States in the Middle East, in this region. What is our aim? What is our purpose? Why are we there? Why are Americans dying in this region? That is the issue. And he's the only politician who spoke so clearly about this. Why are we there? It's every other politician just accepts it like the wallpaper. It's a given. Why? He went on to say, he said, what happened on 9/11 is that we didn't have a strategy. We didn't have bipartisan agreement. We didn't have American understanding of it. And instead, we had a policy coup in this country. A coup, a policy coup. Some hard-nosed people took over the direction of American policy, and they never bothered to inform the rest of us. When he says we didn't have American understanding of it, what is he saying? He's saying that we Americans at the Pentagon, Department of Defense, we didn't understand what happened on 9/11. We didn't have American understanding. Well, what did we have? We had Israeli understanding was given to us. Ehud Barak came on TV before the towers fell and said this was done by Osama bin Laden. It's now time to go to war with, war on terror has to begin. Well, this is what was happening at the Pentagon. These so-called Zionist neocons, Paul Wolfowitz, Dov Zakheim, and Douglas Feith, are meeting with the Israeli chief of staff. Shaul Mofaz, right here, chief of staff, highest man in Israeli military. And they're talking the war plan, what they're going to do. This is January 2002. And what was the war plan? Well, he found out about a few weeks after 9/11. He said, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. One of the generals called me in. He said, sir, we've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq. He said, we're going to war with Iraq? Why? I don't know, he said. I came back a few weeks later. By that time, we were bombing Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, sir, it's much worse than that. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. Where did this policy come from? He didn't know. Nobody did. It came from Wolfowitz. It came from this meeting, with the Israelis. The Israelis were telling the Americans, this is what you got to do now. And this general is a good guy. He's actually Jewish. He's half Jewish. His mom was Jewish, or his father was Jewish, I think. Yeah, that way, vice versa. And here's the plan. This is the plan that is being put into effect. It's called the Yinon Plan. Oded Yinon was a strategic advisor to Ariel Sharon from the Likud, and the plan basically was presented in 1982 and translated by this Israel Shahak in 1982. And the plan is basically to break up all the Arab countries into ethnic fragments, exactly like what was done to Yugoslavia. It's called Balkanization. It's Israel's strategic plan behind the war on terror. And they talk about it a little bit in the New York Times. This map is from the New York Times, an article called Imagining a Remapped Middle East, 2013. So in Syria, they've broken Syria into pieces now. They're trying to break Syria into pieces. Iraq is being broken into pieces. Saudi Arabia is on the chopping block as well, so they're not out of trouble. And the Yinon Plan, according to Shahak, represents the accurate and detailed plan of the present Zionist regime. That's 1982. That was during the war in Lebanon. The Likud for the Middle East. The Likud is the hard right party that controls Israel and has controlled Israel since 1977. Virtually unchecked since 1977, the Likud. And it's based on the division of the whole area into small states with the dissolution of all existing Arab states, breaking them up. And this is a quote from the document itself. The dissolution of Syria and Iraq is Israel's primary target on the Eastern Front. The dissolution of the military power of those states serves as the primary short-term target. That's exactly what the United States military has done in Syria and Iraq. Well, in Iraq, we accomplished it through war. In Syria, we're doing it covertly, trying to destroy the Syrian government, the Syrian leadership, breaking the country up into pieces. This is criminal. This is criminal. And this is another quote from the document. Iraq, rich in oil on the one hand and internally torn on the other, is guaranteed as a candidate for Israel's targets. In Iraq, a division into provinces along ethnic and religious lines, as in Syria during Ottoman times, is possible. So that's what they're doing. An Iraq a section for Sunnis, a section for Shiites, and a section for the Kurds in the north. Now, there's always money involved, too. And the oil reserves in Syria and northern Iraq are in the Kurdish areas. The Kurdish areas have increased to incorporate more oil. Okay, that's where the oil is. And the oil is owned by a company called Janel, which is owned by the Rothschilds. So the Rothschilds' profit have been owning the oil since 2002 in northern Iraq. So they want to get their hands on that strategic oil and profit from it. The Rothschilds also are owners of the oil reserves in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. So if they're successful, if the Americans and the Israelis are successful in breaking Iraq or Syria into pieces, there will no longer be a return address for the Golan Heights. So then Israel's annexation will be unchallenged. And again, media moguls like Mr. Murdoch are created by Mr. Rothschild, the Rothschild family, in order to control public opinion. And these men, Murdoch and Rothschild, are co-owners of the oil of those occupied territories in Iraq and Syria. So it's not very far. The connections are very close here. They own the oil, they own the media. And here, in the Iraq, in the Golan Heights, their company includes this nice fellow over here, Dick Cheney. And this fellow down here is their Israeli president. His name is Efi Eitam. And he said, "We will have to kill them all." He's referring to the Palestinians. And these are the kind of people. And what they've done, I live in Europe, what they've done is they've created this rivers of refugees. And there are currently more refugees in Europe than there were since World War II. The situation is very, very grave. They're coming in from everywhere. But there's many of them are just coming in from the war, the areas that have been devastated by the war. So now I'm going to give a few brief points of the Israeli connection to 9/11, because when you understand the Israeli connection to 9/11, then you will understand how this has benefited their war on terror operation. First of all, 9/11 and the war on terror were both conceived by Israeli military intelligence. That's not Mossad, that's military intelligence in the 1970s under the leadership of Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin. Who's Menachem Begin? He's the father of terrorism. He was asked in 1974 by a British journalist, "How does it feel, in the light of all that's going on, to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East?" And Begin said, "In the Middle East?" He said, "In all the world." So Begin put on himself the mantle of being the father of terrorism in all the world. He's not exaggerating. He's not running away from that. He's embracing it. Here he is as a younger man in 1948. He came from Russia. He came to Palestine in 1942, became the leader of the Irgun, which was the hard right militia, bombed the King David Hotel, was involved in the Deir Yassin massacre in 1948, created the Likud in 1973, became prime minister in 1977, and promptly invaded Lebanon. And his party, called the Irgun, his militia, this is their emblem. And you can see that they have something called Eretz Israel, means the land of Israel in Hebrew. And their land of Israel incorporates part of Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, part of Saudi Arabia. This is their aspiration, their territorial aspiration. And a brief note is that the Irgun was created by a man named Vladimir Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was the head of something called the New Zionist Organization, which was based in New York City. And in 1940, Mr. Jabotinsky died, and the reins of the power went on to his executive secretary, who was Mr. Netanyahu. Benzion Netanyahu, which is Bibi's father. So this is all a very small group of people, extremists, expansionists, and militant. And as you see, this is what they did. They're proud of this. They blew up the King David Hotel. King David Hotel was the head of British military headquarters in Palestine during the Mandate period, and they put bombs in there. And it's very similar to 9/11 because this was an act which destroyed a lot of evidence, which would have meant that a lot of the Zionist heads would have been hanged. And in order to prevent that from happening, they had to destroy the evidence. And here is when Mr. Begin came to the United States in December of 1948, Albert Einstein, wrote a letter with 26 other prominent American Jews saying, "This man is dangerous. Americans, wake up." And part of the letter he said here, "The public avowals of Begin's party," which was the party that became the Likud, "are no guide whatsoever to its actual character. Today they speak of freedom, democracy, and anti-imperialism, whereas until recently they openly preached the doctrine of the fascist state. It is in its actions that the terrorist party betrays its real character." The terrorist party. Einstein had no problem calling a spade a spade. He said, "From its past actions, we can judge what it may be expected to do in the future." And what it did in 1946, it did in 2001 in New York City. Now, as I said, the mantle of the Likud passed on to this man who is now the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, Benjamin. In 1976 to 78, he was working for a Rothschild company in Boston called the Boston Consulting Group. Then he left that company, went to Israel, and started with his father, that's his father there, something called the Netanyahu Institute, which never had a building or anything like that. It was just an institute. And they rolled out, their first project was the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism in July of 1979, where they rolled out onto the public stage a propaganda offensive calling for terrorism to become the new boogeyman in the world. And they blamed all the terrorism on the Soviet Union at that time because they wanted to get the United States to fight terrorism in the name of fighting Russia. George Herbert Walker Bush spoke on the third day, on the closing day of the final event at that conference. And then in 1977, of course, Begin came to power in Israel. His coalition, Likud coalition. And his Likud coalition incorporated all of the former heads of the Zionist terrorist gangs like Lehi, the Stern Gang, Irgun, and Haganah. And here, when they came to power, here were the Troika. Here's Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, former head of the Lehi gang, the Stern Gang, and their protege, Ariel Sharon. Now, Yitzhak Shamir, as I said, was the head of the Stern Gang. He had been involved in the murder of the Swedish count who was sent to Palestine in 1948 to try and find a way to make peace with this partition plan of Palestine and Israel. They had partitioned, the United Nations had partitioned the country, giving some parts to Israel, some parts to the Palestinians. But Jerusalem was supposed to maintain as a corpus separatus, as an independent city where everybody could go. But the Israelis, the hardline Israelis like Shamir, didn't want that. So they killed the United Nations ambassador. They killed the United Nations envoy in Bonnie and Clyde style. And a member of that gang who killed Volker Bernadotte was this man's father. This is Rahm Emanuel, the current mayor of Chicago. He was the special advisor to Bill Clinton, and he was the first appointed official of the Obama administration, chief of staff. He's the Israeli in the White House, the Israeli agent in the White House. There's no term limit on them. And Netanyahu went on, after the 1979 conference, he went on to write books, create books from speeches and articles, calling for the war on terrorism to begin. Books like Terrorism, How the West Can Win, Fighting Terrorism. These books came out in the 1980s, and these books were all designed for American people to understand that we have to go to the Middle East and fight terrorism. Why? The logic is a little bit convoluted. What he says, what Mr. Netanyahu says, he says that Israel is only attacked by terrorists, Islamic terrorists, because it's a Western state. It's Western values. It's a Western state. And therefore, he says, it's incumbent on the West to come and fight those bad Muslim terrorists because Israel is attacked only because it's furthest out there. And, that's their logic. Nothing about Palestinian grievances, nothing about the war between the Israelis and Palestinians, just radical Islamic terrorists. Now, when 9/11 happened, Bibi Netanyahu spoke to the New York Times, and he was asked, how will this affect American-Israeli relations? He said, it's very good, he said. Well, he said it's not very good, but it'll generate media sympathy. But who would say that 9/11 was very good when something like 30,000 people were thought to be dead in the rubble, except somebody who saw some benefit from the crime? And the next day he spoke in Jerusalem, and he said, we must build a coalition against terror today. This is September 12th. It's time to take on the militant Islamic regimes with a great deal of strength. We should crush the terrorist infrastructure that threatens the entire free world. Now, in all those flags I showed you in the war on terror, did you see an Israeli flag? No, but the Israelis are in there. What position do you think they play? They're running it. They're running it. They speak the languages, they know the countries, they know the geography. They're the ones who are running the entire thing. We're simply carrying water for them. And he also said, Netanyahu said in 2005, he said, once we squeeze all we can out of the United States, it can dry up and blow away. Nice guy. And Netanyahu then admitted that 9/11 benefits Israel. He said in 2008, he said, speaking in Hebrew at Bar Ilan University, he said, we, Israelis, we are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq. So he's admitting that Israel benefits from 9/11. And he's the head of the Likud party, by the way. So, and then we have this Israeli super agent, Arnon Milchan, the man in the middle here, between two of his friends, Shimon Peres here and Bibi Netanyahu here. And he's also a film producer in Hollywood. He lives mostly in Israel, but he produced JFK, Pretty Woman, Brazil. And he made his first film, though, in 1978, in which the climactic scene was a Boeing 747 crashing into the Pan Am building. That's from 1978. The movie's called The Medusa Touch. So this is called ideation. You have to understand that this man is not just a Hollywood film producer or just an Israeli. He is Israel's highest agent, nuclear smuggling agent. He's very, very tied to the very top. And his first movie he makes in 1978 is doing something called ideation. It's putting the idea out there that planes might fly into buildings one day. And this is the cover of the book. And here you see in 1978, here he's talking with Ezer Weizman, the Israeli defense chief. So these guys, he's at the very top. Was this a coincidence that he made this film, or is it prescience? He became aware that this plot was in the works, and he made a movie so that the public can become aware of the possibility. And here they are setting up the scene. And then his partner in media, Mr. Murdoch, made this film in 2000, in which a Boeing aircraft is hijacked remotely and flown into the World Trade Center. And this aired on Fox TV in March of 2001 and was seen by something like 13 million US viewers. It's called The Lone Gunmen. You see, there's a little play on words there, the lone gunmen, plural. And then the father of Israeli intelligence predicted 9/11 22 years before it happened. 22 years before it happened, Yisrael Harel, the founding father of the Mossad, predicted the 9/11 attacks in New York City. He made the predictions to this man here, Michael Evans, a tall Texan. He's a Jewish guy, but he's a Christian evangelist on TV. And here you see he's very close with the arch-terrorist himself, Menachem Begin. And the prediction went like this. He wrote about it in 2001. He said, he asked Harel, Yisrael Harel, the head of the Mossad, do you think terrorism will come to America? And if so, where and why? And Harel said, the wise intelligence chief said, I fear it will come to you in America. America has the power but not the will to fight terrorism. The terrorists have the will but not the power to fight America, but that could all change with time. As to the where, Harel continued, New York City is a symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely they will strike the Empire State Building, your tallest building and symbol of your power. How odd that the head of Israeli intelligence knew that Arabs would do something like this 22 years before they did it. And then, though, following that prediction, two of his senior men came to New York to get the security contract for the World Trade Center. There were these two fellows here, Zvi Malkin and Avraham Shalom Ben-Dor. Now, the guy that was the head of the company that got the security contract for the World Trade Center in 1987 was this guy. They were working together. But these are the men who worked with Yisrael Harel when the Mossad went to Argentina and kidnapped Eichmann, the German Eichmann. Or when they went to plutonium, they got plutonium in Pennsylvania and shipped illegally plutonium for nuclear warheads from Pennsylvania to Israel. These are the kinds of missions these men did prior to coming to America. So they retired to America and got the security contract for the World Trade Center. But the Port Authority discovered that this man was using a false name. He's the former head of the Shin Bet. And they rejected it. They tore up the contract. But had that contract not been torn up in 1987, then 9/11 probably would have happened in the late 1980s. Because that's when they really wanted it to happen. But they were thwarted, obstructed. And so they didn't quit. They didn't go home. They go back to the beach in Tel Aviv. They went to work for Americans who got the security contract. They went to work for Kroll Associates, Jules Kroll here. His business partner here is Maurice Greenberg. I told you about him. And so those Israeli guys went to work for Jules Kroll, who got the security contract in 1993 after the first bombing. Remember, in 1993, there was a bombing in February, killed 6 people, and it was blamed on, of course, the blind sheikh and Muslims. This is how it happened. There was a bomb in the parking garage downstairs, and Michael Chertoff was part of the prosecution. Michael Chertoff from New Jersey and Judge Mukasey, they prosecuted and framed the case against the blind sheikh. How did that happen? The FBI was very much involved. This was an FBI sting operation. And the FBI paid this man, an Egyptian colonel, they paid him $1 million for him to testify against his friends that he had pulled into this position around him to be the lackeys. They went to jail forever, and he went into the witness protection program with $1 million in his pocket. And the FBI made the bomb that went off that day. That was written in the New York Times. This is not any sort of like controversy stuff. This is in the New York Times. Okay, so the Israelis controlled the security at the U.S. airports on 9/11. That's very important. They controlled the security in the buildings. They controlled the security at the airports. They were at every critical point in the crime. You found Israelis running the operation. So these three guys. And the guy in the middle, he might look familiar. He's Yitzhak Shamir's son. He's Yair Shamir. And they ran the company that did passenger screening at the airports. The company that they own is ICTS. ICTS owned Huntley USA. And then we have in 1983, the Israelis created the enemy. They created the enemy for the war on terror. This is a poster from Afghanistan. This is Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, enemy of our people, crime of the U.S. government. How did that happen? Well, in 1983, the Americans began funding, with the Saudis, began funding Israel to train the Gulbuddin Hekmatyar faction called Hezb Islami in Pakistan. This is during this war against Afghanistan, against the Soviet Union. And the man who ran Israeli military intelligence at the time was Ehud Barak. And what they did is they took weapons from the battlefield in Lebanon, took them to Pakistan, and gave them to the Mujahideen. And then they got these Arabs, like this man, Osama bin Laden, to join into that group. That's called the Afghan Arabs. The Afghan Arabs went to join the jihad against Russia, Soviet Union, in Afghanistan. And this group was being trained by Israeli military intelligence agents who spoke Arabic. Because Israel's got a lot of men from Morocco and from Yemen and from Syria who act and speak and look just like Syrians or Yemenis or Moroccans. And so they went and were training these people who became Al-Qaeda in terrorism. How to make bicycle bombs and car bombs and how to do this and how to do that. And it was all done by Charlie Wilson. Charlie Wilson was the U.S. congressman who did it. Here he is meeting with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. So it was U.S. CIA funding with Saudi funding, with Israelis being the ones who got the money and did the training. And how it worked out was Mossad did the whole thing. The Mossad was working on this guy in Washington. He was a Texan. He was very pro-Israel all along. And the head of Israeli intelligence in Washington, D.C. was his mentor and got him to basically do the operation. And they got the chief, the president of Pakistan, to go along with it. And that's a little bit of money goes a long way. And Rafia, this Zvi Rafia, a quote from the book, Charlie Wilson's War, is very interesting. It's here. Rafia always acted as if he owned Charlie Wilson's congressional office. One of the staffers kept a list of people he needed to lobby. He would use the phones and give projects to the staff and call on Charlie to intervene whenever he needed him. So the Mossad chief is using a congressman's office to run an operation in Pakistan. And the trainer of Osama bin Laden was this man, an Israeli, a Hebrew-speaking double agent. Ostensibly, he's a Egyptian, but he speaks Hebrew. Now, I've lived in Israel, I've lived in Egypt, and I tell you, you do not learn Hebrew in Egypt. This is the man who ran all of those Al-Qaeda attacks in the 1990s. The bombings in Africa, the attack on the USS Cole, all of them. They all come back to this guy here, Ali Muhammad. And he was finally caught up with it. They put him in a federal court. He was found guilty of masterminding the bombings of the embassies in Africa, and he was put into a federal penitentiary for like the rest of his life, from which he promptly disappeared without a trace. He disappeared from a federal penitentiary without a trace. How does that happen? And here's Gulbuddin's gang. In 1994, after losing Saudi and Pakistani support, the gang that the Israelis trained, these guys became Al-Qaeda. And the Afghans became Taliban. And then they said Al-Qaeda just like morphed into Iraq and became ISIS. How did that happen? It happened in this big prison called Bucca. And this is a quote from a senior official of ISIS to the Guardian newspaper. He said, "If there were no American prison in Iraq, there would be no ISIS. Bucca was a factory. It made us all. It built our ideology." Now, to understand how the captors can change the minds of the captives is a whole psychological study. But you use a lot of, you humiliate them, special treatment, et cetera, and you make these people become your servants. That's what that stuff in Abu Ghraib was all about. That was humiliation done on purpose to create this rage among Sunnis against the American occupation. You create like the mad dog who then let loose and say, we have to go kill the mad dog. And there's the mad dog. So 22 years after it was born in Jerusalem in 1979, the Israeli stratagem known as the War on Terror became operational. Again, the purpose of blaming 9/11 on bin Laden was to start the War on Terror, which was already 22 years in the making. It was like a fire they were trying to light. They tried to light it the first time in Lebanon in 1982, when Reagan sent troops to Lebanon who were blown up. They thought the Americans would go to war. Instead, he said, "No, we're out of here. This is crazy." Which is what we should do today. We should get out of there. So also on 9/11, on the day of 9/11, we got the interpretation. There was no American understanding of it. The understanding we got came from this man. Israel's military chief interpreted 9/11 for us, for the English-speaking world. He happened to find himself in the London studio of the BBC World, and he said, "It's time to launch an operational concrete war against terror." And then half an hour later, he was in the studios of Sky TV, giving the same story. So they were lighting the fire. This was the fire. This is the time. This was the spark that lit the fire. It was all planned in advance. And what's the relationship between these two men? Well, Ehud Barak was his commander in the Sayeret Matkal, which is a covert commando force in Israel that serves directly under the chief of staff and Israeli military intelligence. Again, not to be confused with Mossad. Israeli military intelligence is also known as Aman, A-M-A-N. Then we have the situation with these students, these Israeli art students who are going around Florida and Texas and California trying to get into DEA offices. Now, it's hard to find pictures to go along with this, but this is a memorandum. This is a memorandum to the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and the House Intelligence Committee. This is the title of this document is Israeli Surveillance of the Future Hijackers and FBI Suspects in the September 11th Attacks, and their failure to give us adequate warning. The need for a public inquiry. You see, those hijackers that lived in Hollywood, Florida, and different parts of the country, they had within a few blocks of them Israeli teams living around them who were monitoring them. Now, the cover story for these Israelis was they were trying to get in DEA offices and they were spying on the DEA, when in fact their main job was keeping an eye on these Arabs or Arab wannabes to control the operation. Again, read Little Drummer Girl to understand how this is done. But it's a very complicated thing. And here we have, he's calling for a public inquiry. This is what we got in the public. This is the Carl Cameron piece on Fox TV. There were 4 pieces. He said, evidence linking these Israelis to 9/11 is classified. I cannot tell you anything about it. Evidence has been gathered. It is classified information. So this was known to the U.S. intelligence community that these Israelis were working with the 9/11 team. And then in July 2001, the Zionists got the lease for the World Trade Center. When Israelis do something like this, they want to control every single aspect of the crime. Remember, there was a crime, I think it was in Kuwait or Dubai. It was in Dubai. They killed some Palestinian in Dubai a few years ago. And the operation was done in a hotel like this. And the guy from the Palestinian was on the 30th floor. And the Israelis put 35 agents on that floor so that everybody, the cleaning woman, the pilots walking down the hallway, everybody that was on that floor was an Israeli Mossad agent. And so they swarm the whole area. So everywhere you turn, it's an Israeli. You see? And so they wanted in order for the operation to go successfully, they had to control the towers themselves. And how did that happen? It's a little story here. It got to Larry Silverstein. Larry Silverstein here. This is with his lawyer and his wife and his children. He got the keys to the front door. He said, "I'm proud to assume the stewardship of the World Trade Center, one of New York's greatest jewels." July 24th, 2001. This is what was left 5 weeks later of the World Trade Center. How did it happen? Is that Netanyahu and Silverstein were very, very close. This is from an Israeli newspaper, Haaretz. For every Sunday afternoon New York time, Netanyahu would call Silverstein. It made no difference where Netanyahu was. He would always call. And their ties continued after Netanyahu became prime minister in 1996. So you can see these guys were playing telephone tag every Sunday afternoon for a decade. What were they talking about? Football? Girls? Makes no sense. This is the planning. This is the depth of planning that goes on to something like this. And how did these public buildings, the Twin Towers were publicly owned edifices. They belonged to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. They belonged to the states of New York and New Jersey, right? And in order for this to go, they had to privatize them. Well, Ronald Lauder here, son of Estee Lauder, he could use some of his mom's makeup here. He managed the privatization scheme of New York Governor Pataki. Pataki decided, according to Lauder said, let's privatize the World Trade Center. And Pataki said, yeah, that's a good idea. So that's what they did. Now, what is the connection between, Lauder and Rothschild? This is Major General Daniel Rothschild, an Israeli aloof, highest ranked general. Well, Ronald Lauder manages the privatization scheme. He also funds the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy, and Strategy at the Mossad University, IDC, where Major General Danny Rothschild heads Institute for Policy and Strategy. So in Israel, at their condominium in Israel, these two men have a very close relationship. So who's giving the orders here? Probably Rothschild told him to privatize, and it went on to Pataki like that. Is a chain here. And then how did it happen? Well, Lou Eisenberg was the head of the Port Authority at the time, and he oversaw the negotiations that delivered the World Trade Center to this man. This man, Silverstein, however, did not have the money. The money that he used to put down for the World Trade Center lease was borrowed money from GMAC. The very same company went bankrupt in 2008. It was headed by a Zionist then. They plundered it and looted it, and then it went bankrupt. But these two men have a connection through something called the UJA Federation of New York. UJA stands for United Jewish Appeal Federation of New York. He's the national chairman, and he's on the board of policy or board of planning. So again, there's this Zionist back channel that you don't know about, they don't talk about, but this is the channel that matters. So 9/11, the new Pearl Harbor. Again, Zionist global plans for the United States in the 1990s called for a new Pearl Harbor, which 9/11 was. Here we have the Catastrophic Study Group, headed by Philip Zelikow, no less, the man who wrote the report. He headed something called the Catastrophic Terrorism Study Group, and they published this article in Foreign Affairs, CFR Magazine, 1998. Catastrophic Terrorism, Tackling the New Danger. Ashton Carter, John Deutsch, and Philip Zelikow. And what this called for, what they were writing about, is that they were imagining the transforming event, the act of catastrophic terrorism that would change America forever. And here are the two of the men that wrote it, along with Zelikow, Ashton Carter and John Deutsch, former head of the CIA, and this man became the defense minister under Obama. Here, when they wrote that article, they were employees of Rothschild North America, Global Technology Partners, an exclusive affiliate of Rothschild North America. So why I point out these Rothschild connections is you understand that the Israelis are the Israelis, but they're a small nation, but they have very powerful backers. And in the financial community, their main backer is the Rothschild family. The Rothschilds built Israel. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 was written to Lord Rothschild, promising English support, British support for the creation of the Jewish state homeland in Palestine. And then this group, this is called the PNAC Group, Project for a New American Century, headed by Donald Kagan, his daughter-in-law, his two sons here. And they were pushing for an invasion of Afghanistan back in 1990s. Invasion of Iraq in the 1990s. But they called for this global transformation in which the United States should become the global military dominating the entire planet. And that's something called Rebuilding America's Defenses. that we should then conquer the entire world. That'll make it, that's our defense, right? And in order to do this, they said the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. They wrote that exactly 1 year before 9/11. And that's why during the debates between, Al Gore and George Bush, the media often asked, what's your position on regime change? Because they knew that it was coming. The media, they knew that was coming. So then at 9:59 in the morning, the South Tower fell down, but it was destroyed in an explosive demolition. That area where all the molten iron had fallen from is right here. You see, stuff is still falling, but this tower is beginning to explode. And as this expert on explosions testified and told the Albuquerque newspaper, he said this was too methodical. He said his opinion was that there were some explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. It would be difficult for something from a plane to trigger an event like that. 10 days later, he changed his tune because he got money from the Department of Defense. And this is exactly what Donald Trump said as well. Donald Trump said on 9/11 that bombs went off in the building simultaneously with the planes hitting. He was right about that, but 2 days later, he changed his tune. And these are these flows, these dust flows that went through lower Manhattan. This is way too much energy. This is not a gravity collapse. No way could a gravity collapse have so much energy to push the dust so far. And that was the dust that contained those tiny droplets of molten iron. And here's this at 5:20 in the afternoon, Larry Silverstein's third building, the building he actually owned and built, fell straight down into a pile, directly into its footprint. As Claudio said, this is what tipped him off that something was wrong. And here we say, were thermite, each tower of the Twin Towers were held up by these box columns, 47 of these box columns. But we have these box columns that are cut at 45-degree angles and have strange, so it's indicative that thermite was used to cut these columns because every single column had to be cut basically at the same time in order for the buildings to fall. 47 box columns. And these things are huge. The steel is 4 inches thick at the base. The walls, these things are huge. Made in Japan. America couldn't even make such big columns at the time. Then we have the situation here. With the deputy prime minister of Israel was in New York City on 9/11, but it was kept secret. This man, Ehud Olmert, he was the mayor of Jerusalem and deputy prime minister. He was in New York City on September 10th and September 11th, but it was kept out of the media. Why? What was he doing that was so secret that couldn't be reported? Usually if an Israeli politician like that comes to New York, it's front page news. But in this case, it was kept completely secret. But the government knew, the New York authorities knew, FBI knew, immigration knew, but the public was kept clueless. Why? What was he doing? Then he came back about 2 weeks later, and he basically acted like, Giuliani's big brother, helping them deal with the crisis. But why was his visit kept secret? Then there were these 5 dancing Israelis. These were the men who were seen videotaping the first attack on the World Trade Center from New Jersey. They were across the river, and they were videotaping the initial impact. And a woman saw them and said, hey, these guys are cheering and celebrating. They were clicking lighters and high-fiving, getting the picture taken with the burning buildings behind them. They were arrested finally. They were arrested on September 11th and taken to a lockup. They refused to take lie detector tests. They refused to take the polygraph. When they finally did, they failed them. But eventually they were sent back to Israel on visa violations. And this was just a small group. There were scores of them, Israelis, that were arrested in conjunction with 9/11. I called the Israeli embassy like 1 week later, and I said, well, according to my calculation, it must be like 50 Israelis have been arrested. She said, at least that many. And they went back to Israel and said, our purpose was to document the event. Their purpose in being out there with the cameras, taking pictures of the buildings before the first plane hit, was to document the event. Who are they documenting it for? How do they know it's going to happen? And then there were thousands of Israelis who were supposed to be working that day. This is from the Jerusalem Post. There were 4,000 Israelis who were supposed to be in the area of the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, that day, but they all decided not to go to work that day, or they escaped harm in any case. How did that happen? Well, there was an Israeli platform, an Israeli messaging service that sent out warnings several hours before, warning that something terrible was going to happen at the World Trade Center at exactly 8:45. The prediction was accurate to the minute. And Odigo is a company that had their offices in America 2 blocks away from the World Trade Center. But in fact, despite the fact that people had received these warnings with this Odigo messaging system, nobody called New York police and said, something's going to happen. Nobody gave warning, which would have saved thousands of lives. Why didn't they? And then we have this thing about the put options. I don't know if there were these thousands of put options where people basically gambled and bet that the stock of the airlines would go down on 9/11. And what we found out from the 9/11 Commission report, the 9/11 Commission report said a single U.S.-based investor with no ties to Al-Qaeda purchased 95% of the put options on September 6th. Who was that company? It was this man's company, his former company. This man is Buzzy Krongard. Krongard is a kind of a fake name. He's a Jewish guy from Poland. But he was the executive director of the CIA on 9/11, which meant that he oversaw operations of the CIA all across the board. And it was his former company in Baltimore that made all these deals. That's the company that did 95% of the ties, 90% of the trades. His company was called Alex Brown, and it's an investment banking firm with close ties to Israeli military intelligence and Yair Shamir's other company, Cytex. So the head of the CIA, the director of the CIA, executive director of the CIA, his former company was the company that purchased 95% of those United Airlines puts. No conceivable ties to Al-Qaeda, though. And here we see Alvin Krongard. Who is he tied to? Well, all these people. But here is Buzzy Krongard with his wife, and his wife works for Rothschild Asset Management. So you see, there's always this connection. The Rothschilds are always connected, 1 step removed, 2 steps removed, but connected. Then we have the Israeli son of the Mossad controlled the investigation of 9/11. The 9/11 investigation that didn't happen was run by this man here, Michael Chertoff. Michael Chertoff was assistant attorney general on 9/11. And John Ashcroft gave him the portfolio, and for day-to-day decisions, Chertoff had the last word. Now, what was the last word? Destroy the evidence, 24/7, no investigation. If you read the history, you'll see the FBI was involved in confiscating evidence and destroying evidence. And George Bush appointed Michael Chertoff to head Homeland Security after he had done that. And in this position as head of Homeland Security, he maintained his control over the evidence for another few years. So that this man, Michael Chertoff, was in charge of the 9/11 evidence for basically the first decade after 9/11. We saw none of the evidence. It was all destroyed. It was put away in lockers someplace, hidden for the next 100 years. But then Zionists managed the destruction of the evidence. This is the steel. All the steel was taken by barge to New Jersey to 2 junkyards, which the documentation is in my books. But this steel was then cut into small pieces, mixed with other scrap, and sent to Asia. Now, why is that wrong? Because 3,000 people died at this place on 9/11. This is a crime scene of mass murder. And the steel provides evidence to what happened, what caused the destruction of those towers. So in any proper country, you would investigate the crime scene to find out why the towers fell, to determine what killed the people. Not in this country. It's all destroyed. And the junkyards where the steel was destroyed were controlled by Zionist agents. And here we have some of the steel. Some people say there's hardly any steel. There's a lot of steel. There was lots and lots of it, all evidence. And, you can go around the country. You can look at these monuments that they've made out of the steel. I was at one in California the other day, and you can see the steel in California at Martinez, California, by the train station there. It's one of these beams, and something very hot has come through the beam and like punched a hole in it, and it's like there's a big bubble on the backside. You can see that something very, very hot happened to that piece of steel. That's the only evidence we have left, is the little bits that have been saved here and there. And then Zionists presided over the 9/11 lawsuits and litigation you were talking about a little bit earlier today. This is Alvin K. Hellerstein. He's the federal judge who oversaw the tort litigation of 9/11. So he handled the 96 families who held out for a court action. They held out for a trial. 96 families refused to take the money, and they went for this litigation. But there was a problem. His son Joseph in Israel is a lawyer, works for ICTS, that company that managed which was the key defendant in his trial. That's called a first family conflict of interest, primary family conflict of interest. You cannot oversee a case where your son or wife is involved. So that's his son Joe. Joe is the lawyer for the company that represents Kuckerman and ICTS. And he actually worked with those three men I showed you before, Yair Shamir and the other two men. He had worked directly with them. And his daddy in New York is overseeing the litigation in which they are defendants. And what did his dad do? His dad said, towards the end of the trial, he said, I excuse ICTS. You can go home. You're just the parent company. I don't know why you're here. The judge himself just excused one of the defendants. And here's Kenneth Feinberg. This is the man who doled out the money for the U.S. government for the compensation fund. And again, he's very closely tied. His wife is the head of the United Israel Appeal of the Jewish Federation of Washington, and she's on the board of governors of the Jewish Agency, and she works with him on this operation. And this is Sheila Birnbaum, again, another lawyer, very closely tied to Israel. These are the people who oversaw the distribution of the money to the victims' families, where the bottom line is you will not talk about it, you cannot litigate, go home, spend the money. And this is Michael Mukasey, who was very close to Hellerstein. They go to the same congregation in Manhattan, the Zionist congregation. And he oversaw the first bombing in 1993. He also oversaw the court action where Larry Silverstein got double indemnity for the loss of 2 buildings. So instead of getting $2 billion, he got $5 billion. And then Zionists have controlled the 9/11 myth. That is contained in this memorial in downtown Manhattan. This was built by an Israeli. That's the guy. His name is Arad. He constructed the 9/11 Memorial and Legacy. He designed it. His name is Michael Arad. He's the son of Moshe Arad, who was the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. Amazing. So every aspect of this 9/11 saga, even the creation of the monument, is in the hands of high-placed Israelis. So did the Saudis do this? Who are the Israelis covering up for? The Saudis? Unlikely. The German death cult? The Illuminati? They're covering up. This is a political crime carried out by Israeli military intelligence, and they're covering it up. Of course, Israeli military intelligence has very big backers, like the Rothschilds, who own the media in this country. Today, the media in this country is owned, 95% of the media in this country is owned by 6 companies. And they're all controlled by big finance. They're obliged to their creditors. So Mayor Bloomberg and Netanyahu, they're discussing the names at the 9/11 Memorial. 4 names. And then the media in New York, like the New York Times, have ignored 9/11 evidence for 16 years. This is 3 years after 9/11, on the day. This is the lead editorial, public knowledge of 9/11. They say, in the 3 years since 9/11, we've begun to understand that it's possible to know what happened without knowing what happened. Full stop. That's all you need to know. Nothing. This is the end of the program, and this is a quotation from a guy named Alan Sabrowski, who wrote the foreword to my little book, The War on Terror. And he said, the evidential trail for 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq runs from PNAC, AIPAC, and their cohorts through the mostly Jewish neocons, Wolfowitz and those guys, in the Bush administration, and back to the Israeli government. None of the denials and political machinations can alter that essential reality. So, this is the end, and my basic message is that 9/11 and the war on terror are deceptions. Deceptions of the highest magnitude. Deceptions that have been imposed on the entire world. And the only way to defeat deception is to increase awareness of the truth, which is what Claudio Marti's group is doing, what you all are doing, what we are doing with the face of truth. We're putting a face on the understanding that we've been lied to. But I can tell you, we've got a long way to go. We have to grow this movement. So I want to thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your time.